Listen up.
A grim and alarming assessment about the impact of climate change. Even worse, it found that countries around the world are not doing nearly enough right now to slow the damage before it becomes worse. The probability of avoiding dangerous levels of global average temperature increases is dwindling.
If you look at the global emissions, they are still going up.
That's according to a new UN report. It found the planet will have to reduce carbon emissions by 7.6% a year between 2020 and 2030. Instead, emissions have been increasing by about 1.5% a year over the past decade.
We had little hope a couple of years ago that the CO2 part of the emissions had basically been stable for a few years, and we hope that that indicated a stabilization. So it started to increase again, and it doesn't look too good.
As part of the 2015 Paris Climate Accord, nearly 200 countries, including the U.S., had vowed to take action to limit temperature rise to between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius, or about 2.7 to 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Beyond those levels, scientists warn the climate will reach a dangerous tipping point. But the goal is slipping out of reach. Greenhouse gas emissions reached a record level last year, the highest since pre-industrial times. Many countries are not on track to meet the goals of the Paris Accord. And under President Trump, the U.S. is withdrawing from the Paris Agreement effective next year.
Had we acted in 2010, we would have had to reduce our emissions by 3.3% a year. Now, because of climate procrastination, which we have essentially had during these 10 years, we are looking at a 7.6% reduction every year. But the science tells us that we can do this.
If serious action is not taken, the UN warned that global average temperatures could rise as much as 7 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. The challenge ahead is enormous, and it comes amid daunting estimates over the impact of what's already happened. A recent study found that greenhouse gases' warming effect on the planet has increased by 43% just since 1990. Let's explore some of these questions with a climate scientist. He is Radley Horton. He works at the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory at Columbia University.
Before he weighs in, I want to weigh in on this particular conversation. This is another reason why that a lot of people believe that Donald Trump is and has become reckless. Because he does not believe that humanity is doing this at an accelerated rate to the point that it could become catastrophic for not just the U.S., but catastrophic for lots of people all over the planet. And we're just not talking about coastal lying areas that's going to have to be out hundreds of millions of dollars just to build flood walls to keep from the flooding from coming in, invading into their cities and basically destroying their habitat. But we're talking about major hurricanes and droughts. I mean, right now over in Australia, they're receiving a bad drought this year. I just got to seeing on the news a while ago that they've had a major fire out in Southern California to the point of last night they had to evacuate up to 55, I think it was 55,000 people had to be evacuated in one particular area because of a fire that was out of control. Right now, they've got some storms coming in that's going to dampen out the fire, but in exchange, it's going to create havoc towards mudslides. So you go from one extreme to another towards these perils that are steadily bombarding the planet and affecting the Homo sapien race. If people does not wake up to what is going on, it is going to be absolutely horrible for generations that haven't been born yet or that recently have been born that are going to have to live through this, because by the time it exceeds and peaks to its worst area, I'm pretty sure by that time I'm going to already be dead and gone, because it's obvious that the people don't want to support a ministry that supports peace. So they want chaos, they want reckless politicians, they want storms, they want us to be $23 trillion in debt, they want all the chaos pertaining to the 2.3 million incarcerated people that's either in jails or prisons. It's pretty obvious that this is what the American people want, beginning right here in Northwest Tennessee. Right here in Northwest Tennessee. They've had 30 years to buckle up and to wake up. 30 years. And if they haven't done it by now, the only thing that I can say is what that they're doing to themselves. They have no one else to blame, because defeat will fall upon to the feet of those who could have changed the direction of humanity but chose not to. Out of greed, selfishness, unbelief, whatever terminology that you want to use, that's okay with me. But the fact of the matter is, it's going to be, and I can see it every day, and I know if I can see it, as uneducated as I am, other people can see how that the atmosphere is steadily changing. How come whenever other people put out warnings like this, we still have a president that is in total denial about what is going on? He's become reckless. Some people say that he don't know no better. How can you not know the facts that's in front of you pertaining to catastrophic environmental global warming? How can you not identify this towards the weather becoming so erratical? Let's watch this.
Dr. Orton, welcome to the NewsHour. Thank you very much for being here. I want to ask you, first of all, this sounds pretty dire. I mean, to say that we've got, starting right now, to reduce emissions by over 7.5% a year, or we face catastrophe. Is it that dire?
I believe it is that dire when we think about the climate risks that we're facing, Judy. In order to not blow through this 1.5 degree Celsius warming target, just as you said, we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by on the order of 7 or 8% per year. By 2030, we have to have 50% less emissions each year than we do today to avoid the worst impacts that we could see from climate change.
Where does the fault lie here? We heard one of the scientists, it caught my ear. He said because of climate procrastination. Who's been procrastinating?
Well, the short answer is just about everybody. Really, to get to where we need to be, we need to see much greater ambition. Especially, I think the leadership has to lie primarily with the large economies that historically have burned so many fossil fuels. And remember, these fossil fuels stay in the atmosphere for a very long time. So we're still experiencing today warming and sea level rise from emissions, for example, by the United States, European Union, for decades past. So that's the first place that you have to look. And those are also the countries that have benefited historically from their greenhouse gas emissions in terms of economic growth. So those are the countries we have to look at first. But the short answer is we've gotten ourselves into such a pickle now by delaying, reducing our emissions, that now every country in the world really has to get on board with dramatically reducing their emissions.
I'm asking because I heard a panel discussion over the weekend where one of the experts said the U.S. can't wait for China and India, for example, to go first because of their population. The U.S. has to go ahead and move on its own. So you're saying everybody's got to move right now?
Everybody's got to move, absolutely. Here in the U.S., I think by not being more ambitious and indeed by pulling out of the protocol, other countries see that as a signal that maybe they can afford to back off a little bit. So we need...
Exactly. In other words, putting out the wrong messages, which have been manufactured by Donald J. Trump. Up until then, there was a unified effort in trying to sustain this crisis that is befallen upon to the Homo sapien race here on the planet. But whenever Donald Trump got in there, he wanted to pull away from the Paris Accord and treat global warming as it's somebody's imagination. It's somebody's pigmentation. I couldn't tell you the amount of times since I have traveled around all over America, being blessed by going from coast to coast 3 different times on my own dime. But I couldn't tell you the amount of times that I have pulled up into ball fields, not necessarily ball fields pertaining to schools, but parks and military bases, to where I would start observing and looking around and seeing where the lights was still burning in broad daylight. And I'm thinking to myself, what a wasteful way to spend the taxpayers' money by going ahead and burning those type of big lights day and night, night and day. Now I'm sure that somebody has convinced somebody that by turning the lights off and then later turning them back on, that it costs more money to warm up them lights, to get them started, than it would be just to keep them glowing 24/7. There's got to be a reason why that somebody leaving the light switch on day and night. But the fact of the matter is, we are a very, very wasteful country. And now we are becoming a reckless country. Not only are we wasteful, but we are reckless. You know, I could have went out and bought any type of vehicle that I desired, from a diesel dually to a Corvette. Anything from A to Z in between there. But instead, I went out, I bought a little old Honda that gets about 32, 35 miles to the gallon. It's an older model car. It ain't nowhere near new. But I bought a little car that is economically efficient whenever it comes to me trying to be self-conscientious of not being wasteful, which deviates onto the character of being reckless. I've got clocks, timers on different things out here to where they only stay on at certain times, and then after that they go out. I try to be as conscientiously conservative as I know to be in my spending, regardless whether it's indoors or outdoors. That way, hopefully, there'll be enough energy that will last towards helping other people because of my conservativeness. But the majority of people don't think the way I think. I'm going to say probably 50% of the population here in America don't think that way, because they've got enough money, they've got enough clout, they've got enough this, they've got enough that they can afford to be careless. They can afford to be reckless. The thing about it is, if it's reckless towards them is one thing, but once it starts affecting all of our lives to the point that their recklessness is now affecting the planet, that's whenever the people or the government or certain agencies need to promulgate laws that will make people do the right thing. If they're not going to voluntarily do the right thing by putting in certain lights, certain light fixtures, kind of like whenever you walk into a bathroom now at different places, the lights will automatically come on. Well, as soon as you walk out, the lights will automatically go off. What's the sense of being wasteful in wasting that energy? If it was mandated in homes that they had to have these type of instruments and these type of bulbs, I think that in and of itself would be a big plus towards slowing down some of this. Then you start looking at various motors that puts out all this extra heat, all this extra energy pertaining to motors in behind your refrigerators, your washers, your dryers, other types of motors that keep things at check in your home. Then you talk about the motors outside pertaining to your diesel engines, your jets. They said a while ago that the airline industry is increasing 6% every year. 6%. That's just only on the airline industry. Do you have any idea how much that the cruisers, the boats, are increasing every year towards people being able to take these big cruise ships? I bet they're increasing more like 15 or 20% every year. Everybody's gotten involved in wanting to make a boat. And don't matter if it's a little boat, fishing boat, party boat, pontoon boat, or a huge ship. Everybody's gotten involved towards wanting to build boats. Well, guess what? Boats use energy. Boats put out artificial heat, just like your light bulb. This is extreme, what this man is talking about. And if we do not take him serious in the next 25, 30, 40 years, in which, like I said, I'll be gone from here by then, thank God. But in the next 25, 30, 40 years from now, it will be absolutely catastrophic in a lot of these areas that are just now starting to feel the effects of climate global warming.
More ambition from everybody. One thing to keep in mind is even those countries that made pledges for 2020, the only way this was going to work was if they then amplified and made much more aggressive their emissions pledges beginning in 2020. So what we're actually seeing is many, not all countries, failing to meet the emissions reduction pledges that they had said they'd get to by 2020. That sets the stage for us needing far more ambitious reductions in our emissions over the coming decade.
Do you believe it's doable, that this can be done?
So here's the paradox. Despite all the negative things we've been talking about so far, in some ways I think it's more doable than ever, because I think we're starting to see some early signs of a mass mobilization. It's still a small amount of greenhouse gas emissions averted, but when we look at powerful levers in society that are showing some signs of activating around this issue, I'm thinking, for example, about youth movements, people who are saying that they're not going to accept the way things were done in the past. When they think about the colleges they're going to go to, the jobs they want to have in the future, where they're going to make their investments, they're going to be picking industries that are focused on reducing emissions and focused on thinking about how they're going to be vulnerable to climate change. That could, I think, lead to a whole shift of revenues in the future. That's one example. We could also talk about what we've seen in terms of renewable energy prices dropping faster than predicted, battery technologies starting to reach a price parity. We've already hit the point where renewables are outcompeting fossil fuels such as coal just about everywhere. So we're seeing signs of that mobilization. The question is it happening fast enough?
And just quickly, what are some examples of the tough trade-offs that are going to have to be made?
So a few of the sectors that are really, really challenging. When we think about aviation-related emissions, aviation emissions are growing roughly 6% per year as people fly more. We do not have a viable substitute right now for fossil fuels for aviation. Similarly, in heavy industry, think about things like mining, steel smelting. Those require fossil fuels. We don't have solutions today. So there are no easy fixes there. In terms of other types of trade-offs, even where we see renewables reaching parity, there are going to be some existing entrenched interests that could suffer in the short term, but for society, it's a net gain. We see new jobs, we see new areas of economic growth going forward, and critically, As we quickly reduce our emissions, we avoid or avert some of these catastrophic damages that we're going to see if we fail to adapt. If we don't, for example, get emissions down, get sea level rise to slow, think of the costs we're going to be looking at in terms of trying to adapt, trying to build seawalls, having to retreat from vulnerable areas. Those costs exceed anything that greenhouse gas emissions reductions could look like.
And just finally, how much of the tough choices that have to be made are really political choices?
I think fundamentally this is a political problem. You're absolutely right. The technology already exists to get us quickly towards where we need to be. Those sectors I mentioned that are thorny notwithstanding. If we can quickly reduce our emissions in renewables, for example, if we can get the electric grid off of fossil fuels, if we can get the transportation sector off of fossil fuels, the land-based transportation, those are things we could do today. If we do that aggressively, we buy ourselves time for currently pie-in-the-sky technologies to maybe become viable. I'm talking here about things like directly pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. We don't have an ability to do that today, but can we buy ourselves enough time with the right investments, and maybe in 10 or 20 years, something like that will be feasible, allowing us to actually lower carbon concentrations. But to be clear, we're not there today, hence the need for greater ambition across the board in society now.
Well, it's important to end with at least a piece of an uplifting note here. Dr. Radley Horton, thank you very much. Columbia University, thank you.
Thank you.
$143 million people in the Latin American communities. Africa, Southeast Asia, by 2050. 143 million people. That's half of everybody that's in the United States right now. Think about that. Our next calendar date is 2020. 2020. Now this is an estimated, rough estimated analogy. What if they're off? What if instead of it being 143 million, maybe it's 243 million? What if they're off and instead of it being 20 and 50, maybe it's by 20 and 40? Because if you've taken notice, there's a pattern of whenever this first become a global international crisis 20 some odd years ago, whenever Al Gore first started talking about it, every year they move it up. Every year the ice is melting more rapidly. Every year the water on the coastal areas is getting worse. Every year the heat or the fires out in California or in Australia are getting worse, or the smog is getting worse. Every year they move it up. So their estimated analogy of 143 million could be off by 100 million. And their estimated analogy towards it being 20 and 50, which is 30 years from now, may very well be off too by 10 or 15 years. This is going to be a lot of people's Achilles heel, depending upon where they live. And I still to this day believe that that's the reason why Jesus, foreseeing these things that was going to occur, towards trying to give out advisories to his people, to his followers, by telling them that when you shall see these things coming upon to the earth, flee into the mountains. Go where it's safer. Get away from the water's edges. Go up into the higher elevations and get away from all the chaos with all the people. And maybe you'll have a more pleasanter, safer life up there in the mountains. More so than you would be if you was in a recreation area, let's say Florida. And Florida, we know that the Everglades are disappearing every day. And the Everglades is what brings fresh supply of water to Miami and Tampa and Orlando. Basically, all of southern Florida depend upon the Everglades. Well, if the Everglades disappear, so does their fresh water supply. Has anybody thought about that? How are you going to feed and provide fresh water for about probably 12 to 15, maybe 20 million people in southern Florida? I mean, don't get me wrong, it's a very nice place to visit. They have some of the most beautifulest roads and bridges and landscapes and beaches and hotel front properties that the world has to offer. But if the people can't survive, what's going to happen in southern Florida? What's going to happen to all these coastal lining areas where the water keeps rising and rising and rising? They're going to disappear. That's what's going to happen to them. Sad. I want to stop this on this particular note because this particular message needs to be devoted all in the regard towards environmental crisis that is no longer looked upon as being a theory or an ideal. But these are now facts. And of course, whenever you have somebody in charge pertaining to Donald Trump that wants to deny all these facts, there you go there. Proof is in the pudding. Good luck to all of us. Shalom.